You are about to witness authentic footage from a real battlefield. Authentic footage captured in the midst of combat by body cameras, Kharkiv, Teretic sector, Serebransky forest. Intense battles where every decision is a matter of life or death. Will everyone make it out alive? Watch until the end. What you are about to see contains real war footage from the conflict between Ukraine and Russia. It is presented strictly for documentary purposes. We do not encourage violence. Recommended for 18+. Join the operation of the reconnaissance officers of the 5th Detachment of Omega Special Forces and the 12th Azov Brigade in the Serebransky Forest, a strategic area known for its challenges and relentless terrain. The large-scale mission, intended to support the National Guard, aimed to reach the designated line and repel the occupying forces, establishing a vital defense line for subsequent operations. The video captures a segment of the assault in the Green Zone, where the dense jungle, swampy terrain, and newly established enemy positions, camouflaged in the natural environment, required Omega soldiers to operate with extreme caution and stealth. Using specialized tactics, the reconnaissance men approached the enemy from the flanks, securing a crucial tactical advantage. The main objective was to reach a strategic crossing point, isolate enemy forces, and provide support for the advance of Ukrainian troops to the north, aligning the front line with precision. The 5th Detachment of Omega Special Forces, also known as Omega Special Forces, is an elite unit of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, specializing in reconnaissance, infiltration, and intelligence gathering missions. This unit is highly trained to operate in high-risk environments, often behind enemy lines, to disrupt opposing forces and provide essential information for the success of offensives. Their advanced training and skills in covert operations make them a crucial component in combat strategies and in gaining a tactical advantage. The Serebransky Forest is a strategic combat area in the context of the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, known for its harsh conditions and a combination of dense jungles and swamps. This region has a complex topography that makes troop movement challenging, with limited visibility and navigation difficulties. While the terrain is ideal for stealth operations, it also presents significant obstacles for conventional units, making the identification and elimination of enemies a constant challenge. This environment provides an advantage for special forces like the 5th Detachment of Omega Special Forces, who can use their guerrilla warfare skills to infiltrate precisely and destabilize enemy forces. However, the complexity of the terrain requires careful and well-planned movements to ensure the success of operations. The Serebransky Forest symbolizes the challenges faced in modern warfare, where the terrain can be as challenging as the enemies, and every decision and movement must be made with extreme precision and strategy. During the assault, the Special Forces faced strong resistance, but managed to destabilize enemy forces, allowing the advance of Ukrainian troops to proceed without major setbacks. This is the video of Ukrainian soldiers in combat for a village. We can observe the supply of ammunition and fire being directed at the enemy forces from a stationary position.
Вермей, пока сажай птичку. По нам мы пока на перерыве. Рассосредоточились, пацики. Ниже к земле. Волк, сдвигайся позиция, не стой на месте, прием. Волк, я Фокс, я ж тебе говорю, не стой на месте, двигайся. Дай 300-500 вперед, прием.
Я град на 20-500 метров, они положили впереди меня.
Давай назад так. Найди место, где сидишь, где команды, прием.
the fighters seek shelter from enemy fire, returning to the firing position to make strategic shots against the occupying forces. On the battlefield, the stationary position represents a significant challenge for the soldiers who need to stay in one place, often under intense enemy fire. Maintaining this position requires immense discipline and careful tactical coordination, as any mistake can expose the fighters to great risks. In situations like these, the ability to defend a strategic position while also protecting oneself from the enemy is crucial to the success of the mission. This approach also highlights the constant tension that soldiers face as they wait for the right moment to act or move, always alert to changes in combat conditions.
Выходи! Плюс, правее 100, максимум вниз.
Вперед. Давай.
Выстрел!
Вот. Ниже 100, правее 100.
Хорошо.
Ебал, надо ближе.
Плюс. Даю, вермей, даю. Ой, пошла. Выстрел!
Не получится.
Выстрел! Смотри. Есть еще. Забираем.
To ensure secrecy and safety, weapons are camouflaged with improvised materials, while the evacuation of wounded comrades is carefully planned. Facing the enemy is a major challenge, but the mission of capturing live prisoners often requires a more careful and complex approach. That's why the Reconnaissance Platoon makes full use of all its skills while working to restore order in the Teretic sector, neutralizing threats with precision along the way. On the battlefield, soldiers face the difficult decision of surrendering or continuing to fight, a harsh reality for all combatants on Ukrainian soil. Here is the combat operation of the Special Forces Reconnaissance Platoon, 2nd Battalion, 12th Azov Brigade. The Teretic sector is a region of strategic significance in the context of the current conflict. This location plays a crucial role, serving as a vital tactical point where military forces concentrate to secure control over essential territory. In this sector, combat operations are intense, requiring specialized forces capable of facing major threats and clearing areas with a strong enemy presence.
Ходимо до тої ями, де сиділи. Бачу підвал. Субота. В мене тут підвал забитий чимось внутрі. Есть кто? Кто там? Кто? Камик, с какой бригады, пацаны?
Парни, только
Точно один.
Выходи, руки вперед. Теперь, чтобы я видел. Правильно, выходи по чуть-чуть. Медленно.
В подвале кто-то есть?
Вышел.
В подвале кто-то есть?
Один.
Точно никого нету?
А нет, никого.
Заходи в
нет.
подвал, сейчас посидим с тобой.
Вместе с ним просто прикрой.
Тут кто? Убери это, убери это.
И надеюсь, фонарик.
Почему
Ну, типа, поехать
Выходь, давай.
убивать на...
Все, выходит.
Сейчас. Давай, быстрее.
The Special Forces Reconnaissance Platoon, part of the 2nd Company, 12th Azov Brigade, is an elite unit of Ukraine, specializing in reconnaissance, infiltration, and intelligence-gathering missions. Trained to operate in high-risk situations, often behind enemy lines, their primary mission is to identify and neutralize threats before they can spread. With advanced training and cutting-edge equipment, this platoon plays a critical role in combat operations, being essential for the success of offensives or for restoring control in critical areas like the Teretic sector.
Выходи! Вылазь! Выходи! Быстрее! Направо, сразу направо! Давай! Давай быстрее! Давай, давай, давай! Давай! Направо, направо! Пожалуйста! Быстрее! Быстрее туда! Давай! Быстрее! Быстрее!
The combination of the Reconnaissance Platoon skills and the strategic location of the Teretic sector reflects the complexity of military operations in the conflict. Special forces are called to act quickly and accurately, using guerrilla tactics and covert operations to weaken enemy resistance and ensure the region's stability. In this documentary, the platoon's operation offers an in-depth look at the crucial role of these elite units, where the speed of decisions and intelligence gathering can be decisive in the course of a battle.
Сразу понял, что азовцы.
Крой, крой! Друже, перед траншеєю, якщо буде птичка,
The Hydra unit of the 2nd Mechanized Company, which belongs to the 2nd Mechanized Battalion of the 3rd Assault Brigade, is conducting a strategic operation in the Kharkiv region. Several enemy forces advance between two forward positions and fortify themselves in a small trench. The mission of the assault soldiers is to ensure the integrity of the area.
Сдавайся, жить будешь!
Kharkiv, one of the main cities in Ukraine, holds significant historical and strategic importance in military contexts. Located in the northeast of the country, near the border with Russia, Kharkiv has been an important center of industrial and logistical activities, with a major base for the production of weapons and military equipment. This makes it a strategic target in any conflict involving Ukraine, especially due to its proximity to Russia.
Плюс-плюс! Мальчика выше. Так, 1200.
The city also has strong military infrastructure, with training schools and defense facilities, in addition to being a vital transportation hub for the movement of troops and supplies.
Еще попробуй. Да. Давай.
During the conflict in Ukraine, Kharkiv has been one of the most important areas, being a critical point for both defense and military offensives due to its strategic value for both sides of the conflict. Thus, military operations in the Kharkiv region are of interest not only because of its geopolitical location, but also for its relevance as a logistics operations center and a frontline in decisive battles.
Наступний бліндаж. Закинули гранату, зробили простріл. Плюс-плюс, плюс-плюс. Друзі, я розумію, що ситуація не штатна, але в нас постріл снайпера, в нас... года. 8000 километров от Украины живет. Да, это возле Владивостока.
The enemy combatants were neutralized, and the region was restored. The mission was completed successfully.
Проверил. Проверь там.
In a critical mission, Ukrainian soldiers arrive at the starting position, ready to face an aerial threat. Armed with the Stinger man-portable air defense system and camouflaged for winter, they cautiously advanced towards the firing position, located a short distance from the starting point. The Stinger man-portable air defense system, MANPADS, is one of the most effective and widely used weapons in the armed forces, designed to neutralize low-altitude aerial targets, such as planes, helicopters, and drones. Developed in the United States, this system was designed to be operated by a single soldier, making it a crucial tool in combat operations, especially in guerrilla warfare scenarios and difficult-to-access areas, such as those faced by Ukrainian forces in the current conflict. Its mobility and precision make the Stinger indispensable for elite troops, providing an immediate response against aerial threats in a combat environment. For the Ukrainian soldiers, the Stinger is not just a weapon, but a shield against enemy forces in the sky. In a battle where ground troops often lack their own air support, the ability to neutralize enemy aircraft becomes essential for the safety of the troops and to destabilize the enemy's air superiority.
Звідти теж очі.
Ага.
Це бажано теж так не щоб не виставляти. Їздить цей. Якась броня, і вона сюди.
Ага.
Нашу машину обстреляли.
Наши передавали.
То наши обстреляли его что?
Не, наши не стреляли.
Короче, калибр явно не 5,45 и не 7,62.
Нашу по вам, по этой машине тура уебала.
Дивися, наш СП знаходиться, як отсюди виходиш,
Ага.
і типу туди наліво. І якщо вони...
В них тактика інакша. Вони заходять безшумно, випускають ракети,
At a decisive moment, a precise shot hits a Russian Su-25, but the response from the battlefield requires a strategic retreat to ensure the team's safety. The mission continues as the soldiers reassess the situation while awaiting new instructions, ready to act as circumstances evolve. If you made it to the end, hit the like button now so you don't miss the upcoming videos. And answer me, do you think Ukraine's special forces are managing to ensure stability in strategic areas? Yes, the strategy is working well. No, there's still a lot to be done.